Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to the War for BADAB. How are you all liking it so far? You've only seen a small portion of all of the custom art I've had created for this project. I also offer up all of the artworks as little bonuses to my Patreon supporters as well. So if you are a Patreon or Subscribe Star supporter of me, you should head on over there and there should be plenty of art pieces for you to download already. Now, on to the serious business of the day. In the last episode, the Maelstrom Warders launched one of their most ambitious and successful campaigns to date, the Scourge campaign. This bought the resource extraction grid many years of peace and prosperity, but after the departure of the Charnel Guard, or perhaps it would be more accurate to say, after the Warders were deprived of the Charnel Guard, they were forced ever more onto the defensive. Of course, the Astral Claws and the Mantis Warriors maintained considerable fleets of their own, in addition to the Imperial Navy elements organized within their area of control. But the Charnel Guard were one out of the two fully fleet-based chapters, with the other being the Lamenters. They possessed far greater numbers of battle barges and strike craft than the other two, and thusly the loss of the Charnel Guard severely limited the overall mobility and void-based firepower of the Warders. As a result of this, expeditions into the outer reaches of the Maelstrom Warp Storm became ever more difficult to carry out, and thusly became less and less frequent. Previously, the Warders had been able to strike into the enemy's midst, to destroy coalescing threats before they could become a real danger to the resource extraction grid. And then, of course, there was the Unhallowed Heart, slipping quietly yet maliciously like a knife out of the Maelstrom and in between the Autonomous Zone's ribs. It not only speared a considerable hole through the Warders' outlying detection grid, it also led to severe losses amongst the Warders and their fleet elements. And of perhaps even greater significance than the physical and material damages done was the harm inflicted on the Warders standing within the Imperium, particularly in relations to the Inquisition. An organization that does not forgive and that does not forget. Despite the Warders' repeated pleas for a chapter to replace the Charnel Guard, none was ever forthcoming, and one does not need an overly active imagination to think who might be blocking such an otherwise reasonable request. And as is so often the case, bad news begets more bad news. Over the next 3 decades, the Astral Claws, Lamenters, and Mantis Warriors were desperately scrambling to stabilize the sector. The Unhallowed Heart had done a great deal of damage, particularly to the early warning network, and the many piratical raiding groups still hiding out within the Maelstrom were swift to take advantage of this. Bereft of one of its 2 fleet-based chapters, the remaining 3,000 Space Marines spread themselves as thinly as they could to keep up a patchwork defense of the grid. It was during a period of elevated raiding activity that Rovik Blake, chapter master of the Astral Claws, issued an instruction to the other chapters. None of the Warders were to be allowed beyond the borders of the extraction grid. The potential risk of excessive casualties pursuing the enemy into the Maelstrom zone was not something that the Warders could afford. They were just barely keeping everything together, and even a single unfortunate engagement could see the entire precariously built-up balance collapse virtually overnight. It was, in all due reality, a sensible decision, and probably the only real option, because Rovik was correct. The Warders had been stretched thin as it was with 4 chapters. With 3, they had no margin for error. But Rovik's decision also meant that the Warders surrendered any last opportunity they may have had to prevent further raids before they were launched out of the Maelstrom storm. As a direct result of this, a vast armada of orc freebooters and raiders were gathering within the edges of the warp anomaly. And in 715 Millennia 41, the Greenskin Armada lit their warp engines and set course directly for the BADAB sector. And the Warders were not able to stop them. The numbers, the ferocity, the brutality of the Orc incursion was on a scale rarely seen since the Warders took up their position, and only after having penetrated deep into the BADAB sector were the Orcs finally stopped by the full strength of the Astral Claws on their home turf. This had been a massive humiliation for the Astral Claws. They were the governors, essentially, of the resource extraction grid. They were the leadership of the Warders, and their home territory had nearly been burned by green-skinned savages. Rovik Blake had, throughout his entire career, been a methodical and careful commander. Not one to take unnecessary risks, he nevertheless ordered the pursuit of the remaining greenskins well past the borders of the Maelstrom Zone and into the warp anomaly. The Astral Claws had always been a proud chapter, and their long and illustrious record gives them plenty of reason to be so as well. But after 3 decades of fighting what must have felt like a losing war, the Greenskins coming this close to destroying their base of operations must have been the straw that broke the camel's back. Without waiting for further reinforcement from Imperial Navy elements or their fellow Warders chapters, Rovik Blake led his Astral Claws in a ferocious pursuit of the Orc Raiders. The unrelenting drive and aggression of the Space Marine vessels ensuring that only a handful of Orc ships made it back to their base of operation. This was to be the Astral Claws' revenge, their payoff. The Orcs had threatened to burn their home, now they would make damn sure the Orcs lost theirs instead. In the cold blue glow of the colossal star Hellcyrus, the Astral Claws fleet came across the Orcs' base. The system had once been home to an unidentified, uninhabited planet, which had later been shattered through some astronomic phenomenon. The Orcs had taken to turning this huge planetary debris field into a base of operation, and had transformed one of the large chunks of the X-planet into a rock, a space-borne base, from which their ships could operate. It might just be that the Astral Claws' rash actions might have led them to a great prize. Orc raids into the grid had been increasing rapidly over the last 3 decades, and here was an unequaled opportunity to neutralize their presumed base of operations. Realizing that a victory unmatched since the end of the Scourge campaign was within his grasp, Rovik immediately ordered all fleet elements to close on the enemy's base and engage it immediately. Realizing there was nowhere else to run, the Orc terror ships turned around, and now well within the protective umbrella of their base's own weapon batteries, turned to fight the Astral Claws. What had at first appeared to be nothing more than a mopping up engagement to finish off a routed foe quickly turned into a pitched space battle. The Orc terror ships were no real match for the strike cruisers and battle barges of the Astral Claws, but they were now joined by the defense flotilla of the Rock. Heavier kill cruisers and the Rock's own batteries were now opening up on the Astartes fleet elements. Nevertheless, the God Empress finest drove on into the hail of fire, knowing full well that if the Rock could be destroyed, or at the very least its warlord slain, the rest of the fleet would scatter and be easy prey for their further pursuit. The quickest and easiest way to achieve that objective was to board the Rock. The vessels of the Space Marine Armada were powerful indeed, but it is the Astartes themselves that are the real weapon, and so boarding torpedoes drilled into the Rock to dispatch combat squads deep within its cavernous hull, whilst flights of Thunderhawks sought out massive cavernous areas of the Rock that had been converted into crude hangars. In a lightning offensive, tactical squads and assault marines moved deep within the Rock, whilst Devastators set up murderous kill zones along corridors, preventing the Orcs from easily utilizing their massively superior numbers, and allowing the Astral Claws to carve their way through one hold to another, each one being a gigantic space carved out by the Orcs into the corpse of a planet. It was dangerously easy to get lost within such a structure, and the augur readings taken from the ships outside, whilst engaged in a space battle, mind you, were not necessarily helpful. Furthermore, Orc technology is famously temperamental and difficult to classify. Whereas in any other installation, it would have been a simple task even for a fleet engaged in a pitched battle to locate a center of command. They would simply follow the power lines. Whichever area of the installation was the most heavily protected, was not currently engaged in firing at the fleet outside, and was still drawing massive amounts of power, that was likely to be the headquarters. But with the constant, sudden, uncontrollable, and unpredictable power surges coursing through the Rock as its weapon batteries were operating at full capacity, it was impossible to determine with any degree of certainty where such a center might lie, or if the Orcs even had such a thing as a central command station. And unable to locate a head for the decapitating strike, Astral Claw's advantage of their rapid lightning assault lessened second by second, as first dozens, then hundreds, then thousands of Orcs began streaming down every corridor. The Astral Claw's advance, which at first had been swift and assured, became slow and sluggard, and then ground to a halt, and before long, it seemed the Space Marines might be pushed right back off the Rock. It was during one of these confrontations that Rovik Blake finally came face to face with the beast he had come hunting for. A tremendous Orc, several times the size of any of his peers, the Orc Warbot Vorg Manburner strode out from his horde, bellowed his Warg battle cry, and stormed into the Space Marines. Man versus beast, hero versus pirate, the two lords engaged in a titanic conflict as the whole space around them reverberated the sound of battle. Choppers, shooters, bolters, power swords, all hammering and clashing against one another, rebounding from armor, cutting deep into Orc flesh, exploding Space Marines, and shredded Orcs. The ferocity of the engagement was not necessarily to the Astral Claw's advantage. The plan had been to strike quickly, kill the warlord, and then engage in a fighting retreat off the rock. Leaderless, the horde would quickly dissolve, and the Astartes could simply pick them off from range, limiting their own casualties whilst maximizing the orcs. As cathartic as it might be to sink a chainsword into a screaming orc's belly, it nevertheless was risky business to engage the greenskins in melee. A lesson the Imperium would receive a stark reminder of on this day, as Rovik Blake, a champion of humanity and chapter master of the Astral Claws, was overcome by the Orc Warboss, the monster's inhuman strength proving too much for even a master of the Astartes to defeat. His power sword snapped in the Orc Warboss's claw. A backhanded blow sent the chapter master flying, and before he could recover, the monstrous weight of the Orc slammed down upon him, slowly crushing armor, then carapace, then armored breastbone, then lungs, then hearts. Even as his bodyguard fought like lions to reach him and retrieve, if nothing else, the now broken body of the chapter master of the Astral Claws, yet further thousands of the green-skinned savages thronged in from every direction. Soon the Astral Claws were being pushed back across the rock. Despite killing tens of thousands of the devils, there were always more orcs. Guns had been blasted clean off the rock, power centers destroyed, airlocks breached. Entire areas of the rock were in flames or vented to the void. But despite the destruction wrought, the battle was being lost. Outside the rock, in the void, the Astral Claws fleet were offering valiant resistance, but with no sign of the rock or the enemy's ships breaking, they were taking a fierce bombardment. The Astral Claws' flagship, the Seraph of Judgment, was badly damaged and beginning to limp away from the engagement zone. Seeing no hope of victory or of recovering the chapter master's body, the Astral Claws began to withdraw. Bereft of leadership, it was chaotic at first. Each Space Marine is a veteran of countless battles and an elite amongst the elite, but even they are not immune to disorganization. Should they fight on? Should they withdraw? Where should they withdraw to? The Thunderhawks? The boarding pods? Which was the quickest escape? Was it overrun by orcs yet? Which paths were still clear? Where were the Devastators holding their ground? And where had they been overrun or retreated already? In the midst of the prevailing chaos, one Astral Claw captain in particular stood out amongst the rest. The captain of the 3rd Company took de facto command. Issuing a series of level-headed and precise orders, he rearranged the invasion force. Devastators fell back to strategic points where they could cover the maximum number of intersections. The tactical squads began to collapse back upon the corridors covered by the Devastators, and then swiftly began falling back, whilst assault marines launched rapid hit-and-run counterattacks to disrupt and slow the enemy's pursuit. The situation that had been heartbeats away from a complete disaster that might threaten the very existence of the Astral Claws chapter in its entirety had turned into a controlled, organized fighting withdrawal. The Astral Claws forces began to pull back to the hangars that were still in their command, where they intended to load onto Thunderhawks and escape the rock. Once the orcs realized that the Space Marines were no longer willing to play around with them, they redoubled their efforts to crush the chapter that had so brazenly invaded their homes. But once more, due to the directions of the third company captain, despite the ever-increasing number of green-skinned monsters storming through the corridors in uncountable throngs, wherever they went, they were checked by a hail of heavy bolter and frag missile fire. And as soon as the vile Xenos had been robbed of their momentum, spirited countercharges led by assault marines and terminators would send them reeling back down the corridors once more, buying precious minutes for the Astral Claws to load onto their Thunderhawks and blast off back into the void, where the battle was still raging. The fleet elements remained close enough to the rock to collect the escaping Thunderhawks, before forming up a protective cordon around the Seraph of Judgment, by far the most badly stricken vessel, as it had spearheaded the attack and remained closest to the Orc base. Forming a protective cordon, they protected the Seraph of Judgment from multiple assaults launched by the Orcs, as the monsters outside, just like within, redoubled their efforts to crush the interlopers. A lengthy and hotly contested void action was then fought between the two, the Imperial vessels launching repeated long-range lance and bombardment volleys to ward off the Orc terror ships and to force them away from the easier paths out of the massed debris belt. On the other side, the Orcs repeatedly threw themselves at the Astartes ships, seeing their prey ever so slowly and painfully maneuver their way out of the belt. None of their ships could risk jumping into the warp as long as they were still surrounded by the scattered corpse of a planet. Any attempt to do so would almost certainly lead to the annihilation of the vessel and the death of all those aboard, and so there was no other choice but to fire retro thrusters and slowly, painfully, glacially glide out of the system. It must have been absolute nail-biting hell for the crew and the Astartes aboard, as their ships rocked again and again from huge volleys of bombardment cannons mounted in the armored prows of terror ships and kill cruisers. But after many hours of desperate, slow and deliberate maneuvering, the fleet made it to the outer edges of the debris belt. The very first ship to jump to safety was the Seraph of Judgment, the battered, bruised and bloodied battle barge sliding into the warp before its brethren to ensure its safety. And as soon as the flagship was securely on its way back to BADAB, beaten, bloody, bruised and yes, defeated, the rest of the Astral Claws, battle barges and strike cruisers also left the system. There is a fine line that divides a bold and brilliant plan from a foolhardy one, and often it is nothing more than random circumstance that decides which is which. In this case, however, the Astral Claws had fallen on the wrong side of that fine dividing line, and they had paid the price for it. Their chapter master of 200 years had fallen in single combat with an Orc warboss. In addition to this, their fleet had suffered severe damage, albeit no losses. The Seraph of Judgment was the most badly bruised, and she would not fight again for many, many months. Perhaps more significantly, the Astral Claws had undoubtedly suffered severe casualties in the boarding operations of the Orc Rock, as they would not have left their chapter master behind without having made every effort to reclaim his body. This was not an easy defeat for a proud and honourable chapter like the Astral Claws to accept. And perhaps this fact is reflected in their choice of the next chapter master. Perhaps the Astral Claws were seeking some solace, some justification to write the Battle of Hell Cyrus off as more than a simple defeat at the hands of tragically underestimated savages. Some silver lining, perhaps. because the choice of the next chapter master fell on the youngest warrior to ever have attained that rank in the chapter's history. The commander of the 3rd Company of the Astral Claws, the very selfsame one that had led the heroic escape from the rock, that had organized the defense and evacuated the warriors. The captain of the 3rd Company had turned the battle into something other than merely a humiliating rout. He had created a spark of heroism in its midst. He had created something with which the Astral Claws could look back upon with pride. And so, he was elected the new chapter master of the Astral Claws and de facto leader of the Warders of the Maelstrom. And his name was to echo throughout history as Luft Huron. And that is just simply such a goddamn awesome way to end an episode that I'll cut it off right there at 25 minutes. Maybe the next one will be longer. Maybe. Until then, I have been Arch. Thank you all very much for watching, and I hope to see you all again soon. Have a good day.